The morning had started like any other, calm, predictable, forgettable. Passengers boarded Flight 287 with coffees in hand, backpacks slung over shoulders, earbuds already inserted as if preparing to mute the world. The Denver sky was a pale, unthreatening blue, the kind that made travelers relax their shoulders, convinced this flight, this simple 2-hour hop to Salt Lake City, would be nothing more than a quick cruise through friendly skies. At 9:41 a.m., the aircraft began its ascent. Engines hummed with a smooth, familiar confidence, the cabin lights dimmed into a soft glow, and the flight attendants walked the aisles with practiced smiles. Bobbies settled. Seatbelts clicked. Newspapers unfolded. Everything felt normal. Complacently normal. No one knew that within the hour, every person aboard would be gripping their seats, whispering prayers, and locking eyes with strangers in silent desperation. At 10:15 a.m., cruising altitude was reached. The captain made his standard announcement, steady voice, warm tone, the kind of delivery that made people trust him without ever seeing his face. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've leveled at 34,000 feet. Smooth air ahead. Sit back, relax." His voice cut abruptly as the seatbelt sign dinged unexpectedly. Outside, the sky still looked tame, but suddenly the aircraft jerked with a force so sharp it sent several passengers lurching forward. Luggage rattled inside overhead bins. A tray of orange juice pitched sideways, splashing across a mother's lap. Gasps filled the cabin. Then came the second jolt, deeper, harsher, like something massive had grabbed the plane by its wings and shaken it hard. A toddler began to cry. A teenager laughed nervously. An older man pressed a hand to his chest, steadying his breathing. Marissa, the lead flight attendant, immediately unlatched herself from the jump seat and moved swiftly up the aisle, her training plastered beneath a mask of calm. She reached the cockpit door and tapped lightly. "Captain, everything okay up there?" Another sudden drop. This one felt like an elevator plunging too fast. Several people actually lifted an inch off their seats. A woman shrieked. The lights flickered. Marissa steadied herself on the bulkhead wall. Her heartbeat quickened. But before she could knock again, the intercom crackled. A heavy static-laced sound, like someone had abruptly grabbed the transmitter, then breathing, hard breathing, followed by a voice that stabbed through every passenger's spine like an icicle. "Mayday, mayday, may." It wasn't the polished, controlled voice of the captain they were used to. This was different, raw, panicked, cracking under strain. The sound of someone who had just seen something no pilot ever wants to see at 34,000 feet. The intercom cut off abruptly. The cabin froze. You could hear the breath of the man in 22C hitch. You could hear a baby stop crying mid-whimper. You could even hear the hum of the lights, suddenly ominous, suddenly too loud. Silence followed. Not the normal kind. The kind that comes right before something breaks. Marissa knocked sharply on the cockpit door this time. "Captain, Captain, answer me." No response. A flight attendant behind her mouthed, "Oh my God," after nearly falling when the plane tilted slightly right, then left again. The turbulence was wrong, too sudden, too violent, not like the choppy bumps of bad weather, but something deeper, heavier, something that felt as though the aircraft itself was struggling to stay balanced. Passengers began murmuring. What did he say? Did he say Mayday? Is the pilot unconscious? Can someone go see what's happening? Fear isn't loud at first. It starts in the eyes, in the shallow breaths, in the hands that grip armrests a little too tightly. And fear, once shared, grows fast. At row 17, a young girl pressed her palm against her window, staring out at the clouds swirling beneath them. 11-year-old Ellie Brooks, small for her age, quiet, always observing. Her curly hair was pulled into a messy ponytail that bobbed with each tremor of the aircraft. She blinked rapidly, not at the turbulence, but at the final tone in the pilot's voice before the intercom died. She had heard that tone before. Late nights in her father's study. Cockpit videos. Simulator drills. Emergency briefings played on worn headphones far too big for her head. Her father, a commercial pilot himself, had drilled into her the sound a pilot makes only when everything is falling apart. She knew that sound. She also knew what Mayday meant, even when adults tried to sugarcoat it. Her mother beside her squeezed Ellie's knee. "Honey, it's okay, probably just rough air." But Ellie wasn't looking at her mother. She was staring at the cockpit door as if she could see through it, listening, waiting, counting her own heartbeat as reassurance. She heard the faint hum of engines, the soft thrum of air pressure shifting. But she did not hear the pilots. They were supposed to speak, they always spoke. If turbulence happened, a pilot's voice followed, calm, steady, in control. Instead, nothing. The silence grew heavier, darker, like a black curtain draped over the entire aircraft. Suddenly, a man unbuckled in row 3 and stood up. "Someone has to check what's going on," he yelled, gripping the headrest for balance. Before he took a step, the aircraft gave a violent sideways shudder that hurled him back into his seat. Passengers screamed. A woman clutched her chest. A businessman dropped his phone, which slid several rows down the aisle. Marissa yelled over the chaos, "Everyone stay seated, please stay seated." But she wasn't calm anymore. Her hands kept trembling against the cockpit door as she banged on it again. "Captain, please answer." Still nothing. Ellie clutched the zipper of her backpack. Her mind raced through diagrams, procedures, emergency steps she'd memorized without anyone ever asking her to. Her mother pulled her close, whispering something soothing, but Ellie barely heard it. She heard something else entirely. The clicking. The quiet, rhythmic clicking of warning relays activating in the cockpit beyond the door. Each click a message. Each click a problem. Her father had taught her that pilots speak to their aircraft through controls, and the aircraft speaks back through sounds. What Ellie was hearing now. The aircraft was screaming. She turned slightly in her seat, eyes wide, heart thumping like a trapped bird. She didn't make a sound, but something in her expression caught Marissa's attention. When the flight attendant looked back down the aisle, she saw the girl staring at her with a level of focus far too sharp for an 11-year-old mid-emergency. Then Ellie spoke. Softly, barely above a whisper, but clear enough to silence the rows around her. I know what he said before he stopped." Marissa's brows knit. "Sweetheart, what do you mean?" Ellie swallowed hard, her voice trembling. He wasn't yelling because of turbulence. Passengers leaned in. He was yelling because something in the cockpit failed. The plane shuddered again. But no one looked away from her. Ellie's small fingers tightened around her backpack strap. "And I think I know what went wrong." Silence that followed Ellie's words was deafening. For a moment, every passenger froze in their seat, mouths slightly open, eyes wide, caught between disbelief and the creeping dread that had begun to seep into the cabin. The engines hummed, but the sound was hollow now, almost sinister, as if the plane itself knew something was wrong and was holding its breath. Marissa, the lead flight attendant, was rooted to the cockpit door. Her knuckles were white from pounding on the metal, her heart thudding painfully in her chest. She had trained for emergencies before, turbulence, medical issues, even occasional unruly passengers, but nothing had prepared her for this. A pilot screaming "Mayday" and then falling silent, and now a child claiming she knew what had gone wrong. "Ellie," she said carefully, crouching slightly so she was at the girl's eye level. "Honey, what do you mean you know what went wrong? You're just a kid." Ellie's eyes were wide, a combination of fear and determination that seemed far beyond her years. She gripped her worn backpack straps tightly, knuckles whitening, and whispered, I've been learning from my dad. He's a pilot. He taught me everything: emergencies, cockpit controls, the instruments. I know how to read them. I know how to fix problems." Passengers behind them muttered under their breath. Some chuckled nervously, trying to mask their panic with humor. An 11-year-old, really. But the plane lurched violently, and the laughter died in their throats. The jolt was sudden, and the cabin shook as if the air itself had turned against them. Coffee cups tumbled, plastic forks clattered to the floor, and a baby screamed as its mother tried to comfort it. Marissa took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. She turned back toward the cockpit door and pounded again. "Captain, co-pilot, answer me." Silence. A passenger from the back of the plane shouted, Are we going to crash?" The words barely left his lips before the plane shuddered again, dipping slightly to the left. Marissa stumbled, catching herself on the bulkhead wall. Her eyes scanned the rows of terrified passengers. Panic was creeping in. People were whispering frantic prayers, gripping each other's hands, clinging to anything they could for comfort. Then Ellie spoke again. "They're not unconscious." Marissa's eyebrows rose sharply. "What do you mean?" They can't move. Something's wrong with the controls, the instruments. If I get to the cockpit, I can try to help." A collective gasp ran through the cabin. Marissa blinked. You can help, but she stopped herself. She didn't want to dismiss the girl in front of everyone, but her mind raced. "Ellie, even trained adults can barely handle an emergency like this. You're just a child." Ellie's jaw tightened. "I can do this. My dad taught me. I know what to do." Marissa looked at her, trying to measure the girl's conviction against the sheer impossibility of the situation. She could feel the panic pressing in from every corner of the cabin. People were gripping armrests, holding their children close, whispering prayers and frantic goodbyes. The hum of the engines had become a sinister undertone to the tension that filled the plane. Marissa's mind raced. The cockpit door was locked from the inside, as always. She and the other flight attendants could unlock it only in extreme circumstances, and extreme circumstances were now. But the turbulence was so violent that even approaching the door could be dangerous. A single wrong move could send them sprawling, injuring themselves or someone else. Ellie's voice cut through Marissa's thoughts. "There's another way in." Marissa froze. "What do you mean?" Ellie pointed toward the galley floor. "There's a panel. My dad showed me once. Maintenance uses it sometimes. It leads to the space beneath the cockpit. I can reach the instruments from there, maybe even open the cockpit from the inside." Passengers began whispering again. A kid is going to save us." The turbulence worsened. The plane pitched sharply to the right, throwing some passengers into each other and making luggage tumble from the bins. The lights flickered. Panic was palpable now. Marissa swallowed hard. She knew rationally that letting an 11-year-old crawl into a maintenance tunnel while the plane shook violently was insane. But she also knew that the cockpit could be dead silent for only so long. If she didn't act, if no one acted, they could all die. "Okay," she said finally, her voice trembling. "Show me what to do, but you need to be careful. That tunnel, it's tight, dangerous. One wrong move and—" Ellie nodded. "I'll be careful. I have to try. There's no one else who can." Passengers' eyes followed every movement as Marissa opened the panel on the galley floor. It creaked and groaned as she lifted it, revealing a cramped, dark tunnel. The metal smelled faintly of oil and electricity, cold and metallic, but functional. Ellie took a deep breath and began to crawl into the darkness. Her small body allowed her to navigate the narrow crawl space, her hands brushing against wires and panels. Every inch of the tunnel a silent reminder that she was truly alone, except for the hundreds of lives depending on her. The turbulence continued. The plane lurched violently again, the engines whining, the cabin lights flickering. Marissa held the hatch open with all her strength, straining against the shaking plane. "You can do this," she whispered. "Just get to the cockpit." Ellie nodded, focusing only on the path ahead. She could feel every vibration, every shudder of the plane. Her heart pounded, but she forced herself to breathe steadily. She had practiced emergency drills with her father countless times. She knew the controls, knew the instruments, and knew how to read a plane in distress. Hours, minutes, seconds, it didn't matter. In that crawl space, time became elastic, stretched thin by fear and determination. The plane pitched again, hard enough to knock Ellie sideways. She barely caught herself, her knuckles scraping against the metal tunnel. She whispered to herself, "Focus," just like Dad said, "Focus." Meanwhile, back in the cabin, Marissa tried to keep the passengers calm. She instructed them to remain seated, to buckle up, to breathe. But every shudder of the aircraft sent waves of panic through the cabin. Passengers gripped each other's hands, some closing their eyes, some staring blankly, unable to process the horror of the moment. Ellie pressed on, inching closer to the cockpit. Each movement was calculated, precise, despite the fear gnawing at her chest. She could hear faint clicks and hums from the cockpit beyond the panel, warnings, alarms, indicators that the plane was struggling to maintain altitude. She reached the edge of the cockpit, peeking through the small opening beneath the door. The sight that met her eyes made her stomach drop. Both pilots were slumped over their controls, unmoving. One hand twitched slightly, but otherwise they were completely incapacitated. Ellie swallowed hard. This was worse than anything she had imagined, but she could do this. She had to. She crawled into the cockpit, feeling the cramped space around her, her small hands brushing against wires and panels. She was inside, finally. The weight of the situation pressed down on her, but so did determination. She looked at the controls. The plane was losing altitude, alarms screaming, warning lights flashing red like angry eyes. Her fingers trembled as she reached for the yoke, but she steadied herself. She knew every move mattered. Every second counted. Marissa whispered from the hatch, her voice shaking but determined, "You can do this, Ellie. You can do this." Ellie nodded, taking a deep breath. She glanced at the co-pilot, then the captain. Neither could respond. She was alone in the cockpit, the fate of everyone on board resting on her small shoulders. And in that terrifying electric moment, the plane pitched again violently. The cabin screamed. Passengers gasped, clutched each other, closed their eyes, whispered prayers that seemed to hang in the air like fog. Ellie's hands tightened on the yoke. She whispered to herself, "I can do this. I will do this." And then she began the delicate, terrifying process of taking control. Ellie Brooks crouched beneath the cockpit ceiling, cramped but determined. The metallic scent of machinery and the faint buzz of overloaded instruments filled the small space. Her fingers hovered over the array of switches, buttons, and levers. The plane shuddered again, and the overhead lights flickered violently. A knot of panic twisted in her stomach, but she forced herself to take a deep breath, remembering every lesson her father had drilled into her over the past 6 years. Her father, Captain Tom Brooks, had been insistent. Know your aircraft. Know the instruments. Know what to do before anyone else does. Ellie had memorized diagrams of cockpit layouts, practiced emergency sequences in simulators, and even learned the subtle hums and clicks of warning alarms. She knew the language of planes, an odd skill for an 11-year-old, but today it was the only thing standing between 200 lives and disaster. She reached into her backpack, pulling out a worn, spiral-bound notebook that had become her secret arsenal. The pages were filled with meticulously drawn cockpit diagrams, instrument labels, and handwritten emergency procedures. Some of the ink had smudged, some pages had frayed corners, but every note was priceless now. The plane pitched again, violently tossing the aircraft several degrees off course. The intercom crackled faintly with static from the cabin, Marissa's voice calling up in a tremor, "Ellie, are you okay up there? Can you do it?" Ellie swallowed hard. I have to try," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the shuddering engines. She flipped to the page her father had labeled Autopilot Override and Emergency Descent. The diagrams were detailed. switches marked with red circles, dials annotated with tiny, precise instructions. She traced the lines with her finger. Her hands shook, but she forced herself to steady them. The plane lurched sharply again. Passengers screamed, some crying, some clutching their neighbors, some paralyzed with fear. Coffee sloshed over tray tables, papers danced in the air like frightened birds, and the soft hum of oxygen masks added a surreal, anxious rhythm to the chaos. Ellie's mind raced. She scanned the instruments, altitude dropping fast, airspeed erratic, multiple warning lights flashing red. The autopilot had disengaged. The co-pilot's controls were unresponsive, his head slumped sideways. The captain's face was pale, lips moving silently, as if he were trying to communicate through sheer will. Ellie knew she couldn't waste another second. She located the first emergency switch, the one labeled APU power and autopilot override. Her small fingers hovered, then pressed it decisively. Nothing. The plane shuddered again, harder this time, tilting dangerously. Her heart raced. Her stomach twisted like it was being flipped inside out. She felt the full weight of responsibility pressing down on her shoulders, but she refused to think about failing. 200 lives depended on her, not her age, not her size, not her inexperience. She flipped another page in her notebook, scanning instructions on manual stabilization. She leaned closer to the control panel, eyes darting between the written notes and the instruments in front of her. Slowly, deliberately, she adjusted the yoke, nudging it to compensate for the violent roll of the aircraft. The plane groaned in protest, metal creaking, the engines whining like something alive and angry. Passengers screamed as they felt the slight correction. The temporary relief followed immediately by another jolt. Ellie's mind stayed razor-sharp. She remembered her father's words. "Listen to the plane, Ellie. The plane talks. The instruments, the hums, the vibrations, they tell you what it needs. You have to listen." And so she listened. The slight vibration in the rudder pedals indicated an imbalance. The erratic blinking of the navigation lights showed the plane was tilting. She adjusted the throttle subtly, nudged the yoke, then leaned back to check the instruments. Another jolt. The cabin lights flickered. The overhead bins rattled. A mother screamed, holding her child tightly. An older man muttered a prayer under his breath. Passengers clutched their armrests like lifelines. Ellie ignored them all, focused, steady, calm. She could feel the aircraft responding just slightly to her adjustments. She was beginning to communicate with it, not with words, but with movements, calculations, and instinct honed by years of watching her father. Suddenly, a sound above her made her freeze, a faint, raspy cough from the captain. His head lifted slightly. His eyes fluttered open, pale but aware. Ellie's heart skipped a beat. She whispered, "Sir, can you hear me?" His lips moved, forming words she could barely hear. Ellie. "Yes, sir, it's me. I can help." Her voice shook slightly, but she forced herself to speak with authority. The captain's eyes widened. Recognition dawned. "Brooks, Tom Brooks, daughter." Ellie nodded, swallowing hard. "Yes, I know what to do." He tried to raise a hand toward the controls, but it fell weakly to the side. His voice was hoarse, fragile. You have to stabilize, pull back." Ellie's stomach twisted, but she forced herself to act. She placed both hands on the yoke, taking careful cues from her father's instructions in her notebook. She leaned back slightly, pulling carefully as the plane groaned in protest. Every muscle in her arms screamed. The co-pilot stirred slightly, groaning, but remained slumped over his side. The cockpit smelled faintly of sweat, fear, and metal. Warning lights continued their relentless blinking, red and insistent. In the cabin, Marissa and the other flight attendants worked frantically to keep passengers calm, though their voices quavered under the weight of the situation. People whispered prayers, some audibly crying, others silently gripping the seats in terror. But a subtle shift began to ripple through the passengers, a cautious hope. They could see the small girl up in the cockpit, a lone figure against impossible odds, fighting for them. Ellie's mind raced. She checked the instruments again. Altitude was dropping fast, dangerously fast, airspeed fluctuating, autopilot disengaged. She took a deep breath and flipped to the next page in her notebook, Emergency Descent Recovery. Her father had written it in bold letters, underlined 3 times. Step 1, stabilize the plane. Step 2, level wings. Step 3, regain control of altitude. Ellie began the first step. She nudged the yoke slowly, deliberately, compensating for the plane's violent roll. The aircraft resisted, metal groaning, engines whining in protest. Passengers screamed, some gasping at the jolt, some holding onto children, some closing their eyes in terror. Her small hands tightened, determination burning in her chest. She could feel the aircraft responding just enough, a small shift, a subtle change. The plane leveled slightly but not fully. Ellie's lips pressed into a thin line. She wasn't done, not even close. She moved to step 2, gently adjusting the rudder pedals. The plane tilted again, metal groaning, but she persisted, her fingers trembling but steady. Then she heard it, the faintest click from the co-pilot's side. A groan, a stir. The co-pilot's eyes fluttered open slightly, confusion and fear mixed across his face. Ellie's heart leapt. She whispered, "You're okay, just help me, follow my instructions." The co-pilot nodded weakly, still groggy. The captain's hand twitched again, more coordinated this time. Ellie felt a surge of relief, but there was no time to celebrate. The plane was still in distress. She turned back to the instruments, flipping rapidly through her notebook. Every movement, every adjustment had to be precise. One wrong move could send them plummeting. The turbulence continued. The plane lurched again. Passengers screamed. Drinks spilled. The overhead bins rattled violently. Ellie ignored it all. She focused solely on the cockpit, the yoke, the instruments, the emergency checklist she had memorized and now relied on entirely. The plane groaned, the engine strained, but slowly, subtly, ever so slightly, the descent began to slow. Ellie exhaled softly, not relief, not yet, just progress. She whispered to herself, "I can do this, I will do this." And for the first time in minutes, or perhaps hours, she felt a glimmer of control. The cabin of Flight 287 was a storm of panic. Oxygen masks swayed in the air, passengers clutched one another in terror, and every shudder of the aircraft sent waves of fear cascading down the aisles. Yet in the midst of chaos, a small figure, Ellie Brooks, was preparing to defy every expectation, every limit, and every rule. Back in the galley, Marissa knelt beside the raised panel, staring down at the dark crawlspace that led beneath the cockpit. Her palms were pressed to the metal edges, knuckles white. She felt sweat running down her back, her chest tight as if the plane's fear had leached into her own body. "You really think this is safe?" she asked, her voice trembling as she looked at Ellie, who was poised and determined. Ellie's small hands rested lightly on the edge of the panel. Her wide brown eyes reflected the flickering cabin lights. "No, but nothing about this is safe," she said quietly. "If I don't go, nobody flying this plane." Marissa swallowed hard. She knew the girl was right. The captain and co-pilot were still slumped over their controls, barely conscious, and the plane was losing altitude with every passing second. Every second mattered. Ellie's fingers traced the edge of the hatch. She had memorized this part of the plane from a maintenance diagram her father had shown her years ago, during one of their secret pilot lessons at home. The diagram showed a small service panel hidden in the floor of the galley, designed to give technicians access to the avionics bay beneath the cockpit. It was narrow, cramped, almost impossible for an adult to navigate, but small enough for Ellie to slip through. "This is it," she whispered, pointing. "If the turbulence hasn't jammed it, I can reach the cockpit from underneath." Marissa's stomach knotted. She had always been the rational, calm presence in emergencies, but now she faced the impossible, a child crawling into the guts of an aircraft mid-flight to save hundreds of lives. Yet every instinct told her she had no choice. She took a deep breath, steadying herself. "All right," Marissa said, her voice firm despite the tremor. "But you need to be careful. The tunnel is tight and the metal edges are sharp. One wrong move and—" Ellie nodded. "I know, I'll be careful." The first step was removing the panel. Marissa unscrewed the heavy metal hatch with trembling hands, wincing as it groaned under the strain. The panel lifted with a metallic screech, revealing the narrow, dark crawlspace. The small tunnel smelled faintly of oil and electricity, metallic and cold. Tiny lights blinked from the instruments below, casting eerie shadows. Ellie peered inside, assessing the tight space. Her heart pounded in her chest. She took a deep breath, mentally running through every step she had memorized. The turbulence continued to shake the plane, tossing luggage and passengers in violent, unpredictable motions. She could feel every vibration, every shudder reverberating through the metal floor into her small frame. "Just focus," she whispered to herself, "one step at a time." Marissa held the hatch steady. "Go, Ellie, just go." Ellie's small body slid into the crawlspace. Darkness enveloped her, broken only by the faint blinking lights from below the cockpit. She crawled carefully, elbows scraping against the tunnel walls, knees pressed against the cold metal. Every movement had to be precise. A slip, a jolt, or a misstep could send her tumbling into the machinery below, or worse. As she moved forward, she could feel the plane's violent movements magnified in the narrow space. A sudden shudder sent her against the tunnel wall, leaving her breathless. She gritted her teeth, forcing herself to press on. The voices of terrified passengers and panicked flight attendants echoed above her like distant thunder. Hours, minutes, seconds, it was impossible to tell. The world had shrunk to the crawlspace, the blinking lights, and the cockpit just ahead. Her mind focused on the diagrams her father had drawn in her notebook. Every switch, every dial, every lever was etched into her memory. Finally, she reached the narrow edge beneath the cockpit door. Peering up, she could see the controls, the instruments, the two slumped figures of the pilots. The co-pilot twitched slightly, groaning, but remained unconscious. The captain's face was pale, sweat glistening on his forehead. Ellie's stomach twisted at the sight, but she forced herself to focus. The plane was losing altitude fast. Warning alarms screamed relentlessly, red lights flashing in an urgent, almost angry rhythm. She took a deep breath, trying to steady her shaking hands. She could hear faint, distant voices from the cabin, Marissa instructing passengers, calming them, keeping them from tipping into full panic. She could feel the weight of every life on board pressing down on her. But she forced herself to block out everything except the cockpit, the instruments, and the next step she had to take. Ellie's small hands reached for the edges of the cockpit panel. The metal was cold, unforgiving. She tested the door's latch from beneath. Locked. Not surprising. She consulted her notebook mentally. There was only one way in, the maintenance override panel just above the avionics bay. It had a small lever meant to be used by technicians that could release the cockpit lock. Her fingers found it. She hesitated. The plane pitched again, violently. A scream echoed from the cabin. She felt the vibration shake through her arms and legs. The lever was cold in her hand, but she pressed it with all her strength. A faint click. Her heart leapt. The door wasn't fully open, but it was a start. She tested the latch again, gently, and felt a subtle give. The cockpit was no longer completely sealed. "Good," she whispered. "One more step." She positioned herself carefully, adjusting her small body to reach the controls. Her hands brushed against wires, switches, levers, and panels. Every movement had to be precise. One wrong action could send the plane spiraling out of control. Above her, the passengers continued to murmur, panic rising and falling like waves. Marissa's voice reached her faintly through the hatch. "You're almost there, Ellie. You've got this." Ellie swallowed hard. She could see the captain's head tilt slightly, his fingers twitching weakly. The co-pilot groaned again but did not move. The plane pitched dangerously and warning alarms blared. Her small hands reached for the first crucial control, the autopilot override switch. She remembered her father's instructions, her notebook, every drill, every simulation she had ever practiced. She pressed it. Nothing. The plane groaned under the sudden movement, resisting her tiny hands. She adjusted, nudged, tried again. Slowly, the red warning lights dimmed just slightly. The aircraft leveled fractionally. Her heart raced, adrenaline surging through her veins. Above her, the cabin was a cacophony of terror and hope. Passengers clutched one another, whispered prayers, cried, and screamed. But now, in the midst of chaos, a small glimmer of possibility had appeared. A child, an 11-year-old, navigating a narrow crawlspace beneath the cockpit, doing what no adult could. Ellie glanced up at the captain, whose eyes were open now, dim with fatigue but aware. The co-pilot stirred slightly. The plane pitched again, violently, metal groaning, engines screaming. But Ellie's hands stayed steady, guided by instinct, training, and sheer will. She whispered to herself, "I can do this. I will do this." The cockpit was almost within reach. The plane continued to pitch and groan, alarms blaring, passengers screaming. And yet, in the center of the chaos, Ellie moved forward, unwavering, toward the final step. One more push, one more adjustment, one more chance, and the fate of 200 lives hung in the balance. Ellie Brooks pressed her small body against the narrow edges of the crawlspace, feeling the vibration of the plane reverberate through her bones. Every shudder, every violent pitch of the aircraft reminded her of the stakes. Hundreds of lives depended on her. Every second counted, and every movement had to be precise. The dark tunnel beneath the cockpit smelled metallic, sharp, and electric. Wires lined the walls like veins carrying some vital, unseen life force. The hum of the engines above echoed faintly through the panels, growing louder with each heartbeat. For an instant, Ellie froze. Her fingers brushed against dangling wires, and she imagined what might happen if she made a single mistake. One wrong push, one slip, one missed lever, and the plane could spin out of control. She shook the thought away. Fear was a luxury she couldn't afford. Focus, one step at a time. With careful, measured movements, Ellie crawled forward. The tunnel curved slightly, forcing her to squeeze through an even narrower section. Her backpack scraped against the metal, her elbows bruising on impact. But she moved on, driven by a singular purpose: reach the cockpit. Above her, the cabin continued in chaos. The plane lurched violently to the left, tossing passengers against their restraints. A mother screamed as she clutched her child. Marissa tried to calm everyone, but even her voice trembled as the turbulence worsened. Coffee cups spilled, luggage shifted violently, and the overhead bins rattled like thunder. Ellie felt the vibration of the plane intensify beneath her. She pressed herself closer to the tunnel walls, trying to absorb the shaking with her small frame. Almost there, she whispered to herself. Finally, she reached the section of the crawlspace that led directly beneath the cockpit. A small panel separated her from the controls above, a labyrinth of metal and wires stretching before her. Through the dim blinking lights, she could see the captain slumped over his console, the co-pilot unmoving, their bodies almost statuesque in their stillness. Her stomach twisted. The sight was worse than anything she could have imagined. Both pilots were barely conscious, and the plane was losing altitude fast. Warning alarms blared relentlessly, red lights blinking like urgent eyes. Ellie's small hands reached for the edges of the access panel. The metal was cold, unyielding, unforgiving. She hesitated. For a brief, fleeting moment, fear clawed at her chest, but she forced herself to breathe steadily. Her father had prepared her for this. Every diagram, every procedure, every lesson she had learned about emergency cockpit procedures, this was the culmination of all of it. Her fingers found the small maintenance latch her father had shown her. A faint click echoed as she tested it. The cockpit wasn't fully open, but it was accessible enough to attempt an entry. She squeezed herself further, body twisting and sliding, until she could reach the controls. The plane groaned violently, pitching again as turbulence rocked it. Her knuckles scraped against the metal, leaving faint red marks. Her hands trembled, but she forced them to steady. Every movement mattered. She reached for the autopilot override switch first. She pressed it carefully. Nothing. The plane pitched violently again. She steadied herself, pressing harder, nudging the switch with precise increments. Slowly, the red warning lights blinked less urgently. The aircraft leveled fractionally. Ellie exhaled, tiny beads of sweat dripping down her forehead. One step at a time, focus. She turned her attention to the rudder pedals, gently nudging them to counteract the erratic tilt of the aircraft. The plane groaned in protest, metal flexing under the strain. A violent jolt threw her against the side of the crawlspace, but she gritted her teeth and pressed on. Above, the cabin passengers were clinging to life. Marissa tried to keep them calm, but the fear in the air was almost tangible. The screaming had lessened slightly, replaced by tense murmurs and whispered prayers. But a subtle shift began to ripple through the cabin, a fragile hope. A small girl was fighting the impossible, crawling beneath the cockpit, doing what adults could not. Ellie's gaze returned to the cockpit. The captain's eyes fluttered open briefly. He groaned, lips moving in silent instruction, but his strength was gone. The co-pilot stirred slightly, a weak groan escaping him, but he remained slumped. Ellie's heart leapt. She whispered, "You're okay, I can help. Follow my instructions." The captain's eyes widened as recognition dawned. "Brooks, Tom Brooks, daughter." Ellie nodded, swallowing hard. "Yes, sir, I know what to do." The co-pilot blinked, trying to raise his hand. It fell weakly. The plane pitched again violently. Alarms screamed. Warning lights flashed red. But Ellie's small hand stayed steady, guided by instinct, knowledge, and sheer willpower. She turned her attention to stabilizing the aircraft. She nudged the yoke carefully, pulling back gently, adjusting the throttle and listening to the vibrations, the hums, the clicks of the warning systems. She could feel the aircraft responding ever so slightly. A subtle shift, a fractional change, enough to know she was making progress. The plane shuddered violently again. Passengers screamed, some gripping the seats in front of them, some clinging to loved ones. A mother whispered frantic prayers. A young man muttered, "Please, please, please," under his breath. Ellie ignored everything except the cockpit, the controls, and the next critical step. She moved to the landing gear controls, checking her father's diagrams mentally. She adjusted switches, pulled levers, nudged the yoke, each movement calculated, precise. The plane pitched and groaned, but she persisted, forcing herself to focus. Her heart raced, but determination burned brighter than fear. She could feel the plane responding, tiny corrections stabilizing the descent. Slowly, the altitude drop began to moderate. Warning lights blinked less urgently. The engines groaned, but the violent pitching eased slightly. Ellie glanced up at the captain and co-pilot. The captain's hand twitched, more coordinated this time. The co-pilot's eyelids lifted, awareness returning. She whispered encouragement, "You're okay, we can do this together. Follow my instructions." The co-pilot nodded weakly. The captain's voice, hoarse and trembling, croaked out instructions. "Pull back slowly, stabilize wings." Ellie obeyed, pulling back carefully on the yoke, nudging the rudder pedals. The plane groaned but responded. She was beginning to communicate with it, through movements, instincts, and the training her father had given her. The cabin, sensing the subtle shift, erupted in tentative hope. Passengers clutched hands, whispered prayers, and some even dared to look out the windows, watching the clouds swirl past as the descent moderated. Ellie exhaled slowly, focusing on maintaining control. She had reached the critical point. The cockpit was within reach, the pilots were stirring, and the plane's descent had slowed. But there was still more work to do. One misstep now could undo everything. She tightened her grip on the yoke, braced herself, and prepared for the final crawl into the cockpit proper. The plane shuddered once more, violently, metal groaning, engines screaming. Her small body pressed forward through the cramped space, guided by determination, instinct, and courage beyond her years. And then, as she emerged beneath the control panel, the full reality hit her. She was inside the cockpit, staring directly at the incapacitated pilots, the blinking warning lights, and the trembling aircraft. Every life on board depended on her next move. Her hands hovered over the controls, her breath caught, her heart pounded like a war drum. This was it. The moment of truth. The cockpit was a small, humming chamber of chaos. Warning lights blinked red and angry, illuminating the sweat-slicked faces of the two pilots slumped over the controls. The engines roared outside, each vibration reverberating through the fuselage, rattling the instruments, rattling Ellie's small frame. She pressed herself against the control panel, her knuckles scraping against metal, but her resolve remained unshaken. Ellie's heart pounded, each beat a drum signaling urgency. Hundreds of lives rested on her small shoulders, and every second that passed brought them closer to disaster. She glanced at the captain first. His pale, sweat-streaked face twitched slightly, lips moving silently, trying to form words. She leaned closer. "Sir," she whispered, "can you hear me?" The captain's head shifted slowly, his eyes fluttering open, bleary and unfocused. A faint whisper escaped him, fragile as paper. Ellie." "Yes, sir," she replied, her voice trembling just slightly but firm enough to convey authority. "It's me. I can help. You just need to listen to my instructions." Recognition dawned in his eyes. Tom Brooks, daughter. Ellie nodded. "Yes, sir, I know what to do, just follow me. We can do this together." A faint groan came from the co-pilot, a weak stir, but he remained slumped over, unmoving. The cockpit smelled of sweat, metal, and fear. Alarms screamed from every panel. Red warning lights blinked incessantly, signaling danger, urgency, desperation. Ellie's hands moved to the yoke. She had trained for this moment, mentally and physically, for years under her father's strict guidance. She remembered every diagram, every checklist, every emergency simulation she had completed. She focused entirely on the controls, ignoring the trembling in her limbs, the fear gnawing at her stomach. The plane pitched again, violently. Passengers in the cabin screamed, clutched their loved ones, and prayed. Marissa's voice carried faintly up the intercom, trembling but reassuring. "Ellie, you're doing great. Keep going." Ellie swallowed hard and focused. She nudged the yoke slightly, feeling the plane's response. Metal groaned under the strain. The engines roared, whining like a wounded animal. She adjusted the throttle subtly, and the plane stabilized fractionally. One small victory, but not enough. She glanced at the instruments. Altitude was dropping fast. Airspeed fluctuated dangerously. Autopilot disengaged. The plane's warning systems pulsed red with urgency. She had to act decisively. Her fingers found the autopilot override switch. She pressed it carefully, then nudged it again. The plane groaned, pitching violently to the left. She steadied herself, pressed harder, and finally, the blinking lights dimmed slightly. The aircraft leveled fractionally. Ellie exhaled, tiny beads of sweat sliding down her temple. She could feel the plane responding subtly. The first step had worked, but there were many more to go. She moved to the rudder pedals, nudging them gently to counteract the erratic tilt of the aircraft. The plane groaned and pitched again, but she persisted, adjusting every minute movement carefully. A violent jolt threw her against the side of the cockpit, but she gritted her teeth and pressed on. "Good, good," a weak voice croaked. It was the captain. He had partially recovered enough to speak, though his voice was hoarse, trembling. "Pull back slowly, stabilize wings." Ellie followed his instructions, pulling the yoke back slightly, nudging the rudder pedals. The plane groaned but responded. The co-pilot stirred, blinking rapidly, trying to focus. The cabin was tense. Passengers whispered prayers, some audibly, some silently. Children clutched parents' hands. Adults held their breath. Every person on board felt the subtle shift. The plane was responding. Somehow, against every odds, a small girl was keeping it from plummeting. Ellie's heart raced, but she forced herself to concentrate. The plane's altitude had stabilized marginally, but it was still descending faster than safe. She flipped through her mental checklist. Step 1, stabilize plane. Done. Step 2, level wings. Step 3, regain control of altitude. Step 2 was next. She nudged the rudder pedals again, leaning back slightly to get leverage on the yoke. The plane pitched violently, groaning, metal creaking under stress. Alarms blared in an unrelenting cacophony. She gritted her teeth and pressed on, ignoring the shaking, the fear, the chaos surrounding her. A sudden jolt threw her against the dashboard. Her backpack slipped, sliding slightly across the cockpit floor. She caught herself, her hands trembling, sweat stinging her eyes. For a terrifying second, she felt the weight of the situation. She was in charge. The adults, the pilots, the hundreds of passengers, they were relying on her. And yet she did not falter. She had trained for this. She had prepared. She was ready. "Ellie," the captain whispered weakly, his eyes on her. "You can do this. Trust. Instruments, listen." Ellie nodded, swallowing her fear. "I'm listening, sir. I've got this." Her small hands moved quickly but carefully across the controls. She adjusted the throttle, nudged the yoke, monitored the instruments. Slowly, gradually, the plane began to respond. The violent drops eased. The wings leveled. Altitude stabilized slightly. A faint murmur of hope ran through the cabin. Passengers clutched each other, some daring to peek out the windows, seeing the faint shimmer of clouds pass beneath them. Marissa's voice echoed over the cabin again. "Keep it steady, you're doing amazing." Ellie felt a spark of confidence. She had stabilized the plane enough to prevent immediate disaster, but she wasn't done. Not yet. She had to regain full control. Every move had to be precise. Every second mattered. She glanced at the captain and co-pilot again. The captain's hand twitched slightly, more coordinated now. The co-pilot lifted his head slightly, awareness returning. She whispered encouragement to them. "You're okay. Follow my instructions. We can do this together." The co-pilot nodded weakly. The captain's eyes locked on hers. "Steady, steady," he croaked. Ellie focused, pulling back on the yoke gently, nudging the pedals, adjusting the throttle. The plane groaned but responded. Slowly, imperceptibly at first, then more noticeably, the descent rate decreased. Altitude leveled. Warning lights dimmed slightly. The plane stabilized. The cabin reacted. Whispers of hope turned into quiet cheers, murmurs, prayers. A subtle shift had occurred. A child had taken control and begun saving lives. Ellie exhaled, tiny beads of sweat sliding down her forehead. She had done it. She had stabilized the plane. But she knew better than to celebrate. The descent had slowed, but the plane was still at a dangerous altitude. They had minutes, perhaps seconds, before the next challenge. The captain croaked again, his voice weak but clearer now. "Ellie, you saved us. Keep it steady. We'll help." Ellie nodded, determination burning brighter than fear. "We'll do it together. I've got this." The plane shuddered again, engines whining, metal groaning, but Ellie's hand stayed steady, guided by instinct, knowledge, and sheer will. The cockpit was still tense, still alive with alarms and blinking lights, but for the first time she could see a path forward. She had entered the cockpit alone, against impossible odds, and begun taking control. The silent cockpit was now alive, not with panic but with purpose. Ellie Brooks, 11 years old, had begun her heroic battle. Ellie Brooks' hands clung to the yoke, fingers slick with sweat, knuckles white, as the cockpit shook violently beneath her. Every warning light blinked like angry eyes, engines whined, and the plane groaned as if it were alive and in pain. For the first time, she realized fully the sheer immensity of the responsibility on her small shoulders. Hundreds of lives, including children, parents, and elderly passengers, were relying entirely on her, an 11-year-old girl who had once only dreamed of flying in simulators with her father. The captain, now more alert than before, moved sluggishly, one hand twitching toward the controls. The co-pilot blinked rapidly, fighting to regain consciousness. Both of them were weakened, their strength drained by whatever had incapacitated them mid-flight. Their voices, fragile and hoarse, were little more than whispers, but Ellie could catch fragments of their words. "Steady, don't lose," the captain croaked. "I think recovery," the co-pilot mumbled, voice faltering. Ellie's heart raced. "We can do this together," she thought. "I just have to guide them and we might make it." The plane pitched violently to the left, jerking the cabin violently and sending passengers' screams cascading like thunder. A wave of panic spread from the back of the aircraft. Marissa, her voice trembling but commanding, shouted instructions. "Brace! Brace! Hold on!" Ellie pressed her small hands firmly against the yoke, pulling gently, precisely. The plane groaned, metal screeching under the strain. Warning alarms blared, lights flashed, and the engines roared like a wounded animal. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, the violent tilt eased. The plane leveled fractionally. She glanced at the captain. His eyes, still pale and wide, were locked on hers. "Good, Ellie, steady, steady." Her voice shook only slightly as she responded, "I've got this, sir. Keep following my instructions. We'll get through this." The co-pilot stirred more now, awareness creeping back. He tried to speak and a weak voice croaked, "Throttle, maintain, adjust." Ellie nodded and made the subtle adjustments he indicated. Together, they were beginning to wrestle control from the chaos. But they were not out of danger. The plane's altitude was still dangerously low, its speed unstable. Any misstep and they could plummet into disaster. Ellie remembered her father's words, "Always anticipate, always calculate, always be ready for the next move." She quickly scanned the instruments. Flaps were misaligned, airspeed dangerously variable, engines straining, fuel indicators fluctuating. She began issuing instructions in a firm, confident voice. "Captain, help me adjust the flaps to 20 degrees. Co-pilot, throttle at 70%. We'll stabilize the descent together." The pilots obeyed, their small movements guided entirely by her commands. The co-pilot's fingers, unsteady but recovering, nudged the throttle. The captain's hand adjusted the flaps. The plane responded gradually, a tiny improvement, but it was enough to prevent immediate disaster. In the cabin, passengers began to sense the subtle shift. The violent pitching had eased slightly, though turbulence still shook the aircraft. Mothers clutched children, whispering reassurances, while some older passengers dared to peek out the windows, noticing the clouds swirling past, a silver lining of hope forming amid chaos. Ellie's mind raced. She knew the plane had stabilized temporarily, but the critical phase was ahead, descent toward an emergency landing. She needed to regain full control of the aircraft and guide it safely down to the nearest airport, a challenge far beyond her years. "Captain," she said, voice steadier now, "we need to locate the nearest suitable landing site. Can you pull up navigation?" The captain's hand trembled as he reached for the instruments. He murmured the coordinates of a nearby regional airport, one that could handle an emergency landing. Ellie memorized the runway approach angle, the wind speed, and the estimated distance. Every detail mattered. The plane pitched violently again, and Ellie felt herself pressed against the controls, muscles straining to hold the yoke steady. Warning alarms blared, red lights flashing in a staccato rhythm that set her nerves on fire. She forced herself to focus, ignoring fear. "Co-pilot," she said firmly, "adjust the rudder 5 degrees left. Captain, throttle at 60%. We're starting the approach." The co-pilot's hands shook, but he obeyed. The captain adjusted the throttle. Slowly, the plane began a tentative descent. The violent pitching eased, though turbulence continued to rattle the fuselage. Ellie's mind raced through every emergency drill she had ever practiced with her father. She visualized the instruments, the controls, the sequence of moves required for a safe landing. She felt the plane responding to every adjustment, every nudge, every command. Suddenly, a sharp alarm sounded, engine warning. Red lights flashed furiously. The right engine was overheating, threatening to fail. Panic surged, but Ellie forced herself to breathe. She had prepared for this possibility. "Captain," she said calmly, though her heart raced, "feather the right engine. Co-pilot, reduce power on the right side. Maintain altitude with the left. We can do this." The pilots obeyed, fumbling but following her instructions. The plane groaned under the sudden adjustment, tilting slightly, but Ellie's hand steadied the yoke. The aircraft leveled, the red alarms dimming slightly. Passengers in the cabin clutched each other, some crying openly, some whispering prayers of thanks. The subtle stabilization had given them hope, though the danger was far from over. Ellie's small hands moved across the cockpit controls, adjusting flaps, throttle, and yoke. She calculated descent angle, airspeed, and turbulence with a precision that defied her age. The plane responded, slowly descending toward the distant lights of the emergency airport. The captain whispered, voice trembling but clear, "Ellie, you're incredible. I've never seen anyone." She smiled faintly, her heart pounding. "We're not done yet, sir. One step at a time, we'll land safely. Just follow my instructions." The co-pilot, now more aware, added his voice. "Throttle left, flaps steady." Together they worked as a fragile, improvised team. Ellie giving commands, the pilots executing them, the plane responding gradually. Outside, clouds swirled violently, turbulence shaking the fuselage. Inside, alarms blared intermittently, a reminder that every second was critical. Ellie focused entirely on the runway ahead. The lights were visible now, distant but guiding them. She adjusted the approach angle slightly, compensating for crosswinds and turbulence. Her hands moved with precision, guided by instinct, training, and courage. The plane pitched again violently. Passengers screamed, some holding their breath, some gripping their seats as if sheer will could prevent disaster. Ellie's heart raced, but she did not falter. She steadied the yoke, nudged the rudder, and adjusted throttle. The aircraft responded slowly, gradually descending toward the runway. A faint cheer erupted from the cabin as passengers glimpsed the runway lights through the clouds, the first glimmer of hope since the emergency began. Ellie's heart surged. They were close, but the hardest part was yet to come. Touchdown. Ellie Brooks' small hands gripped the yoke like iron. Her knuckles were white, sweat slicking her palms, her heart hammering with a mix of fear, adrenaline, and determination. The runway lights stretched ahead like a lifeline, a thin, glowing path through the storm of clouds and turbulence. Every passenger, every flight attendant, every life on board now depended entirely on her. The cockpit was tense but alive with fragile teamwork. The captain, his voice hoarse and trembling, whispered instructions, guiding Ellie with his fatting experience. The co-pilot, regaining some awareness, followed her directions shakily but obediently. Together, the three of them were a fragile but determined team, balancing on the knife edge of disaster. "Flaps 20 degrees, Ellie commanded, her voice steady despite the shaking in her chest. "Throttle at 50%, steady descent." The co-pilot's hands fumbled with the switches but obeyed. The captain's eyes never left hers, offering silent encouragement through his nods and faint words. The plane groaned under the strain, metal flexing, as if it, too, understood the peril. Below the cabin was a mix of terror and hope. Passengers clutched hands, whispered prayers, and stared out the windows at the runway lights that had begun to materialize through the storm. Some children's faces were pale with fright, but their eyes held a flicker of trust, a faith that a child in the cockpit was guiding them to safety. Marissa's voice echoed from the back, steadying the panic. "Hold on. We're going to be okay. Keep calm." Ellie's fingers adjusted the yoke, her small hands almost vibrating with effort. She leaned forward, eyes scanning the instruments, memorized sequences flashing in her mind. She could feel every subtle vibration of the plane, every shudder of turbulence, every groan of stressed metal. The aircraft was alive in her hands, responding to her every adjustment. Approaching runway, the captain whispered, voice strained. "Ellie, keep steady, keep steady." Ellie nodded, though the captain couldn't see her. "I've got this," she replied, voice low but firm. "Throttle steady, flaps 20, glide path aligned." The plane dipped suddenly, a violent shudder throwing it several degrees off course. A passenger screamed, clutching their seat. Ellie's stomach twisted, but she focused. She nudged the yoke slightly, adjusted the rudder pedals, and the aircraft responded. Fractionally, but it was enough. Another jolt, more violent this time. Alarms blared, lights flashed red. The engines roared under strain. Yet slowly, painstakingly, Ellie guided the plane back on course. She could see the runway lights growing larger, more defined. The storm clouds parted just enough to reveal a narrow corridor of safety. "Captain," she said, voice firm despite the trembling in her chest, "we're lined up. We can do this. You and the co-pilot follow my instructions precisely. We land together." The captain nodded weakly, hands trembling as he positioned the flaps. The co-pilot adjusted throttle. The plane groaned, groaning louder than ever, engines whining but responding to the coordinated effort. Ellie's eyes locked on the instruments. Altitude, airspeed, glide path, all had to be perfect. One miscalculation, one hesitation, one missed adjustment, and they could crash. She swallowed hard and forced her fear aside. Focus. Precision. Trust the training. The plane pitched violently again as a sudden gust of wind hit. The wings rocked, the fuselage shuddered, and passengers screamed. Ellie pressed her hands firmly on the yoke, guiding the plane with delicate adjustments. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the aircraft began to align with the runway. Marissa's voice rose from the cabin, calm but tense. "We can see the runway. Hold on, everyone. You're doing amazing." Ellie's heart surged. The runway was now clear, illuminated through the storm like a ribbon of light in the darkness. But the descent was still critical. She had to slow the plane, align perfectly, and touch down safely, all without losing control. "Flaps 30 degrees, she instructed. "Throttle 40%, gradual descent, steady, steady." The co-pilot adjusted the throttle, the captain positioned the flaps. The plane groaned, dipping closer to the runway. Ellie's small hands worked furiously, nudging the yoke, monitoring every indicator. The turbulence continued, but the glide path held. The runway grew larger in the windshield, the lights brightening. Passengers clutched hands, whispered prayers, and some dared to smile faintly. Hope had returned, fragile but tangible. The plane pitched violently one last time. A wave of adrenaline surged through Ellie. She leaned forward, pressing firmly on the yoke, pulling back slightly. The landing gear extended with a metallic clank. Instruments beeped in warning, but the plane responded perfectly to her adjustments. "Steady, steady," she whispered to herself. The runway was just ahead now. She adjusted the throttle, nudged the rudder pedals, aligned the wings perfectly. The engines roared under strain, the fuselage vibrating with every gust, but the plane was finally under control. A tense silence filled the cockpit, the storm outside, the alarms inside, all fading into a singular focus. Ellie's small hands guided the plane toward the runway. "Here we go," she whispered, voice trembling but resolute. The plane touched down with a violent bump, landing gear groaning under the impact. The aircraft shuddered along the runway, metal screeching against asphalt, engines whining in protest. Sparks flew briefly from the undercarriage. Passengers screamed, some in terror, some in exhilaration. Ellie maintained control, guiding the plane steadily as it decelerated. Slowly, agonizingly, it rolled along the runway, finally coming to a complete stop. The engines cut, the alarms silenced, and the plane settled. For a moment the cockpit was deathly silent except for Ellie's ragged breathing. Then, one by one, The crew and passengers erupted in cheers, tears, and applause. The cabin shook with relief, gratitude, and disbelief. Mothers hugged children, passengers whispered prayers of thanks, and some sobbed openly. The captain slumped back, exhausted but alive, eyes wide with awe. "Ellie, you did it. You saved all of us." The co-pilot, still shaking, added, I've never seen anything like this. Incredible." Ellie's small shoulders sagged with relief. Tears streamed down her face. "We did it together," she whispered, voice barely audible over the cheers. "All of us, we did it." Marissa rushed to the cockpit, helping Ellie out of the cramped space. She enveloped the girl in a tight embrace. You saved us all," she said, voice choked with emotion. I can't believe." Ellie hugged her back, exhausted but elated. The plane, now safely on the tarmac, was a testament to courage, skill, and extraordinary bravery. Outside, emergency crews approached, ready to assist, but the danger had passed. Passengers poured out of their seats, some embracing flight attendants, some rushing to thank Ellie. Cameras flashed as news crews, alerted by the emergency landing, documented the miraculous event. Social media exploded with the story of an 11-year-old girl who had taken control of a plane mid-flight and saved 200 lives. Ellie stood on the tarmac, small, trembling, and soaked in relief. Journalists shouted questions, passengers surrounded her with gratitude, and crew members hugged her tightly. Her father, Tom Brooks, arrived moments later, breathless and terrified, eyes wide as he took in the scene. "Ellie," he whispered, voice cracking, you saved them, you saved them all." Tears streamed down Ellie's face. I just did what you taught me, Dad. I just remembered everything." The captain approached, hand extended. "Miss Brooks, you are the bravest pilot I've ever known. No adult could have done this better. You are a hero." The co-pilot nodded, voice trembling. "Legendary, simply legendary." Ellie looked around, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what had just happened. 200 lives saved, all because an 11-year-old girl refused to give in to fear, refused to let panic win. She had faced the impossible and, against all odds, emerged victorious. As the sun began to rise, casting golden light over the tarmac, Ellie Brooks stood tall, small but unyielding. She had faced death, chaos, and fear, and had emerged a hero, a girl who had flown a plane when no one else could and brought everyone home safely. And in that moment, she realized something profound. Courage isn't about age, size, or experience. Courage is about heart, determination, and refusing to give up when everything seems lost. The world would soon know her name. But for Ellie, the most important thing was already clear. She had saved lives. She had made a difference. And she would never forget the feeling of that miraculous flight, that impossible landing, and the quiet, heroic power that lived inside her. The end.